Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Vibe podcast. And today we're going to be discussing Professor A.J. Levine's new book, The Gospel of Mark, A Beginner's Guide to the Good News. And I'll have the link to purchase it in the description below in the pinned comment. And yeah, that being said, AJ, thank you for joining me today.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
So when you look at the Gospel of Mark, it's the first gospel. And when you look at Mark in comparison to our other gospels, when you take people as the title of the book is a guide through the text, what do you make of the gospel overall? What jumps out at you, basically?
Well, the idea that Mark is the first gospel is hypothesis. We don't, in fact, know that as fact. And there are a number of people who still want to argue that Matthew was written first, Luke was written second, using Matthew, and Mark is a summary of the two. So, I mean, and you can make an argument for that case. So we already know here in biblical studies that our presuppositions, like who wrote first and who used whom, are going to determine in part what we wind up interpreting. I agree that Mark, with the majority of scholars, that Mark was the first written, and Matthew and Luke looked at Mark and went, what? No Christmas story? No resurrection appearances? Right? It's a schwach gospel. It's weak. It needs stuff. When I look at Mark, when I first read Mark, I didn't like Mark very much because I wanted the Christmas stuff and I wanted the Our Father prayer and I wanted resurrection appearances and I wanted parables like the Good Samaritan or the laborers in the vineyard, and I got nothing. So originally I was not real happy with Mark, but the more I read Mark, the more Mark intrigued me. It's fascinating. So to begin to read Mark is to try to put aside all those other gospel stories with which we are familiar and try to take Mark on Mark's own terms. The sudden appearance of this Jesus who appears to be adopted by God at the baptism, right? No infancy material, no miraculous conception, but right there, he comes out of the water and boom, he's suddenly commissioned. The urgency of the text. Mark, like all the rest of the New Testament, is written in Greek. Mark keeps using the term kaiuthus, and immediately. Mark is bad when it comes to narrative transitions. Everything is and immediately. So he's baptized, and immediately he goes out and proclaims, and immediately he calls his disciples, and immediately he heals somebody, and immediately he engages in an exorcism. As if the urgency is there, the end is coming a week from Tuesday. Get ready, be prepared, drop everything. This is really important stuff. And when you read the text out loud, even if you read it out loud in English, you can get that sense of and immediately. And finally, just for an opening comment, Jesus is totally mysterious here. On the one hand, he's unable to do mighty works in Nazareth, his hometown, because of the people's lack of fidelity. And on the other hand, he can walk on water. People don't walk on water. He can raise the dead. People don't normally do that. You know, might have a one-off with Elijah and a one-off with Elisha, but this is really quite spectacular. He tells people not to tell anybody who he is. Well, how could they not? I mean, he's just raised your daughter from the dead. You're not going to say anything. So he's really quite mysterious all the way through. And his disciples keep saying, who is this guy? Who is this guy? And I think that's what Mark's author wants Mark's audience to wonder about. Who is this guy? You have to make up your own mind.
How does the Gospel of Mark portray John the Baptist and Jesus' relationship? How are they connected with one another?
Well, there's not much of a relationship there. So unlike in Matthew, when Jesus shows up, John says, "Oh, you're the more important one. You ought to be baptizing me." And Jesus in Matthew says, "No, you have to baptize me because it's important for all righteousness." That's a Matthean concern. Or in the Gospel of Luke, where it turns out that they're cousins. And even when the infant John and infant Jesus are in utero, it's clear that infant Jesus is more important than infant John, because pregnant Elizabeth says to Mary, "Oh, you're the mother of my Lord." Okay. I can't imagine two Jewish women actually doing that, with two pregnant Jewish women, one saying, "Your kid's more important than mine." But yeah, this is Luke. We had none of that. So John's out there. And this is how Mark begins. Is this very strange person with a very strange diet and strange clothes, is dunking people in the wilderness, and is in fulfillment of a passage in Isaiah, where Isaiah, originally speaking to the Jews who are in exile in Babylon and saying to them in this word of comfort, your exile is over, you're about to go home. Look, there's a voice crying out, comma, quotation mark, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. In other words, go build a highway from Babylon back to Judea, because your exile is over and you're going home. And Mark repunctuates, which is a typical Jewish way of reading, because in the ancient texts, there are no punctuation marks. There aren't even any vowels, Hebrew text. And for Mark, there's this voice crying out in the wilderness. So now in the wilderness is John's location. Prepare the way of the Lord. Now, Mark knows what he's doing. According to the Gospel of Luke, the earliest followers of Jesus did not call themselves Christians. This is quite a late term coming in. They called themselves members of the way. So that when John has Mark say, prepare the way of the Lord, well, early Christian readers would think, oh, that's our way. The Greek term here is, by the way, hodos. It's where we get the English term odometer, right? It's your mileage indicator. And the Lord is in Greek is kurios, as in Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the Septuagint, uses to translate the name of God, the tetragrammaton, the YHWH, Yahweh language, Adonai, the standard circumlocution. Well, that's also kurios, but that's the title that Mark gives Jesus. So when Mark's readers hear Isaiah proclaim, prepare the way of the Lord, they're going to think, oh, that's the way of Jesus, and Jesus is the Lord. So Mark is already doing some, in effect, translating for us. And then Jesus suddenly shows up. No clear relationship between John and Jesus, other than Jesus submits himself to baptism by John, as many other Jews had done. And Jesus comes out of the water, and a voice calls down from heaven, this is my son, pay attention to him. Wow. As if Jesus was nobody special until this particular moment. Does John think that Jesus is Lord and Savior? It's really not clear, because John gets arrested, and later he will send his disciples to Jesus saying, are you the one who's supposed to come, or are we supposed to wait for somebody else? I mean, that's a really good question, particularly if you're in prison. And we have the pathos. John is beheaded. It's the one story in Mark that doesn't feature Jesus. John is beheaded, and the disciples come to claim his body. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus dies, he dies alone. There's no beloved disciple and Mary Magdalene at the cross, as there was in the Gospel of John. There were women, but they're looking on from a distance. Jesus is alone here. And Mark's passion narrative, more so, I think, than the other three Gospels, it tugs at the heart more because of this sense of being forsaken by his own followers, unlike John.
We've got a super chat question from Solara Knight. Thank you for your super chat. Is the apocalypse Mark 13 describing Judea's fall in 70 AD, similar to Luke 21? Flee Roman armies, Revelation 14, 144,000 children, virgins fled with Savior.
I'm not sure what to do with the 144 children. The 144,000 comes from the book of Revelation. They are 144,000 men who have not known a woman because they are virgins. And they are from the 12 tribes of Israel, which are in Revelation oddly named. So that's not a Markan concern. That also, by the way, leaves me completely out, because I'm not a man and I'm the mother of two. Is Mark referring to what happened in 70? It's certainly possible. So as I was working on this book, I actually wound up giving Mark chapter 13, the so-called little apocalypse, as opposed to the book of Revelation, which is the big apocalypse, its own chapter, because it's so difficult to determine what exactly the timeline is. And just when you think you get to the end, there's wars and rumors of war. Well, that turns out not to be the end. And when you see this abomination of desolation, this abomination sacrifice, that's language from the book of Maccabees, where so now we're celebrating. This is time we're taping during the holiday of Hanukkah. This is the Hanukkah story where King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Syrian Greek king, winds up sacrificing a pig on the altar of Jerusalem, and that's a horrible abomination and a desolating abomination. And Mark uses that term. So is this the destruction of the temple? Yeah, it could be, but then things keep going. So with good apocalypses, right when you think you've got all the cues to figure out, oh, this means this and this means that, I've got my answer key, Mark doesn't go there. And then something else happens. And then something else happens. And then suddenly the Son of Man, a title that Mark uses for Jesus, or Jesus uses for himself, the Son of Man appears to gather his elect from the four ends of the earth. Well, that hasn't happened yet. And that certainly didn't happen when the temple was destroyed. So does Mark know about the destruction of the temple? I think so. Is Mark using this apocalyptic language to refer to it? I think so. But Mark's not limiting this apocalyptic discourse simply to the events of 70. There's more yet to happen. Oh, on the other question, by the way, on the fleeing, right? Yeah. Woe to you who were pregnant and nursing in those days. Whoa. Is the Roman army coming? Yes. But is something worse coming? Yes. So keep watch.
When you look at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, and as you mentioned earlier, the Gospel of Mark doesn't seem to be interested in the origin story of Jesus. There's no nativity story in the Gospel of Mark. Mark just seems to start Jesus out immediately when he's already an adult, and it starts it off with John the Baptist and Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. What do you think that Mark is trying to do with that?
I don't know. So here we can only guess because we're looking at what's not there, and it's very difficult to determine somebody's agenda by saying what that person does not include, or did Mark even know this earlier stuff? But I think Mark wants to do away with some of the more miraculous stuff, or at least downplay it. And if you have a really big Christmas story, it's really hard to downplay Christmas. A really big Easter story, it's hard to downplay that. And I recognize the terms here, Christmas and Easter would be anachronistic. The first half of the Gospel of Mark, the first 8 chapters, Mark 16 chapters long, are filled with miracle stories and exorcisms and all this mighty work stuff. And then we have what's typically called the messianic secret, where Jesus does something really quite amazing and then says to his disciples or to the people who are part of this amazing thing, hey, don't tell anybody. Because I think Mark's agenda is in part to keep the focus on Jesus' suffering, his giving his life, as Mark puts it, as a ransom for many. That's a term that Matthew will pick up, but not Luke or John. Dying, suffering and dying, not just dying, but suffering and dying on behalf of humanity. So if you keep all the focus on the miracles, then the focus on the suffering and dying goes away. And I think Mark wants to have that focus. What's important about Jesus is not the fireworks or the fancy show or the super miracles. Other gods can do that. What's important is that he suffers and dies on behalf of humanity. What's really important is the cross.
What kind of things does the Gospel of Mark get wrong? It's been pointed out that Mark gets certain things that are wrong that Matthew and Luke would later correct.
Well, how would we know? So people have argued that in Mark chapter 7, it's a very long section, it's chapter 7, verses 1 through 20, where Jesus and the Pharisees are having a go at each other over purity laws and offerings to the temple, korban offerings to the temple. That when Jesus says in Mark, it's not what goes into you that makes you impure or unclean, but it's what comes out of you. That Mark extrapolates from that, thus having Jesus declare all foods clean. A number of Bible translations actually put that, thus he declared all foods clean, in parentheses, as if to say, well, this is Mark's extrapolation. This is not what Jesus did. Matthew leaves that out entirely. Matthew gives the same material in Matthew chapter 15, but leaves out the thus declaring all foods clean. And Luke leaves out the entire scene. So does John. So did Mark get Jesus declaring all foods clean wrong? Yeah, probably. But extrapolations are what people do. I mean, this is what we all do. We read a biblical text, and then we extrapolate from that. So what conclusions do we draw from this? To say that Mark got it wrong would be correct in the sense that I don't think Jesus intended to declare all foods clean. Right? If he did, then there wouldn't be disagreements among his early followers about whether Gentiles needed to follow the dietary laws or not, because that would have been a done deal. But did he get it wrong in the sense of being a reader of scripture who extrapolated? No, any more than Jews who say, well, when we are told you can't see the kid in its mother's milk, that means we really shouldn't combine milk and dairy products. And therefore, according to modern kosher laws, cheeseburgers are forbidden. That's equally an extrapolation. Did they get the text wrong? Well, it's not what the Torah says, but it's a legitimate extrapolation from it.
How does the Gospel of Mark portray the teachings of Jesus, and does it differ a bit from how Matthew and Luke portray it, or not really?
Well, I can't say Mark differs because I don't know if Mark knows Matthew and Luke, and you have to know something in order to defer from it. Mark's not really interested in Jesus' teaching material, which also annoys me because I like that teaching material, like the Beatitudes or the extensions, which are sometimes called antitheses. Mark has a few parables, but not as many as Matthew and Luke have. And Mark really is not interested in Jesus' teaching. In fact, when Jesus does a miracle, the people go, well, this is an interesting teaching. Well, what's the teaching component? So again, the focus is not on long-term instruction or teaching. Mark is not particularly didactic in terms of Jesus' sayings. They seem to be fairly ad hoc, like somebody asks him a question and then Jesus says, oh, well, okay, you now ask me a question, so I'll give you a teaching, like don't get divorced. Matthew throws in the loophole, don't get divorced except in cases of porneia. Here, Luke actually follows Mark quite closely. But I don't think that Jesus here is interested in teaching so much as proclaiming, get yourself in gear because the kingdom is at hand, so you better repent. And then I'm going to help you in that. Jesus, I'm going to help you in that process. So at least compared to the other gospels, there's not a whole lot of teaching material. In the Gospel of John, there's not a whole lot of ethical teaching material. Jesus is much more interested in proclaiming himself than in proclaiming a set of ethics that you might find in Matthew or indeed in Luke. Mark is like John, interested in proclaiming Jesus, but a quite different Jesus. In John's Gospel Christology, which is words about the Christ or how the Christ is portrayed, Jesus is, look at me, I'm fantastic, I'm terrific, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, right? In the Gospel of Mark, it's like, I'm the one who suffers and dies for you. Pay attention to that. In John, Jesus doesn't even suffer. He orchestrates his own death. It's a quite different gospel, and it's hard to wrap one's head around this particular non-teaching, non-miraculous, filled with secrecy, filled with confusion, difficult to understand gospel. It's probably the first gospel, Mark.
What does Mark say about the second coming of Jesus, the final judgment?
Oh, it's coming. But that goes back to that earlier very good question about the little apocalypse in chapter 13. It's coming. It's definitely coming. Jesus is the one who was doing the judging. It's based in part on action, but it's also based on part on whether somebody accepts the proclamation of Jesus. And that accepting is part of Mark's challenge to the reader. In Mark chapter 8, which is sometimes called Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus says to the guys, who do people say that I am? What's the word on the street? And you get a bunch of different answers. And then Jesus says, well, who do you think? Right? And that's the question. And Peter, in this bolt of insight, says, oh, you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed, right? And finally, he gets it right. And then Jesus pivots and says, not as he does in Matthew, oh, right, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom, you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. That's Matthew 16. That's not Mark. Mark immediately pivots and says, yes, and the Son of Man will suffer and die on your behalf. Right? You're the glorious Christ. You're terrific. But Jesus says, no, I'm the one who's going to suffer and die. And then Mark says, and he said this plainly. So up to this point in the middle of chapter 8, everything has been in parables. It's been the messianic secret. Jesus has been unclear. He doesn't answer questions directly. Finally, he says something plainly. He's going to die. And that's not what Peter is expecting. And Peter says, in effect, God forbid, this can't happen. And then you get Jesus saying, pivoting again and saying to Peter, right, no, you're wrong. Don't try to tempt me away from what my mission is to be. And even Jesus, by the way, is not entirely thrilled with this. In Gethsemane, he says, I really don't want to die. Nobody would, but this is God's will, and he's going to go through with it.
So Laura Knight, thank you for another super chat. Did King James get Mark right?
In what sense? If we're looking at different translations, the King James Version is not a great translation in that it's not attentive to all of the manuscripts that we have now. It's not attentive to some of the changes that we have, for example, that were informed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was done without consultation of people from different religious traditions. It was very much a Protestant project. And people from different religious traditions have different ways of reading the text, which may in fact get us to a closer historical accuracy. So I would have to know which exact version which exact verse are we talking about to determine if the King James Version got it right or not. Did it get it right for its own time period? It's a fine effort, and the language is lovely. Is it accurate to what Mark's first readers would have taken from the Greek? Then we have a little bit more of a problem. Right. King James will sometimes acclimate itself to the other Gospels and throw in stuff from, say, Matthew and Luke in order to make Mark better conform to the other Gospels. That's not, for me, a good reading. I want Mark to stand on its own before we read it in light of Matthew, Luke, and John.
What about the resurrection narrative in Mark 16 and the longer ending?
Yeah, which the King James is happy to give us. There are actually several longer endings. So now we have a problem. Most scholars today would argue that Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8, where Jesus' women followers have come to the tomb. Mary Magdalene is the one consistent all the way through all four Gospels. But then you get different numbers of women, different changes of women, and so on, different names. And the tomb is empty, and there's a young man. Right, that's the term, young man, not an angel. Right, there's a young man, right, sitting at the tomb, right, saying, "He's not here. He is risen. He will go before you to Galilee. Go tell the guys." And the women are scared. And Mark ends with the Greek ephobunto gar. They flee because they're afraid. In phobunto, you can hear phobic. Right, that's the fear, and gar is the preposition for. You can do that in Greek. You can end a sentence with a preposition. Apparently, you can now do that in English, but I was an English major, and God forbid I would do that. So you get the ending of the gospel is a bunch of scared women fleeing from the tomb. End. Well, we know the mission went out. Somebody told somebody, because otherwise there wouldn't be the Gospel of Mark, and there wouldn't be followers of Jesus to whom Mark is writing. But what do we do with that? So a number of early manuscripts and a number of early followers of Jesus, including Matthew, the people we call Matthew, Luke, and John, said, well, this is not a great way of ending a text. You can't end with a bunch of scared women fleeing the tomb, so we have to have different endings. Some so-called longer ending is a mashup of the resurrection appearances that we have in Matthew and in Luke and in John. And then there were shorter endings, which are also mashups because people weren't quite sure what to say at the end. What I think Mark is doing is saying to us, okay, these women are failed disciples, just as the men failed Jesus in Gethsemane. The last time we see the disciples, Mark says at the arrest in Gethsemane, they all forsook him and fled. That's it. All right, so they're not there at the cross. The last time we see Peter is he's weeping because he's now denied Jesus 3 times, as Jesus had predicted that he would, right? And then he breaks down, and that's it with Peter, and there's no rehabilitation of Peter. Where are we? Where are we readers? What is our job? Are we the ones who are supposed to go out and proclaim, despite the fact that we might be scared to death to do it? And I don't blame them for being scared under the circumstances. If he really is who we think he is, although we've been debating this, then all that stuff in Mark 13 is about to happen, and the end time is here, and the final judgment is around the corner, and my gosh, have we got things to do. That's Mark's urgency.
What do you make of Judas Iscariot and the naked man?
I guess we don't know. Isn't that great? So Judas has no motive in the Gospel of Mark. In Matthew, he betrays Jesus for greed. He says to the high priest, "How much will you give me?" In Luke and John, he's possessed by Satan. In Mark, he turns Jesus in, and we don't know why. He returns the money, and then he just disappears from the text, and we don't know what to do with him. Did he ever get with the program? If the other disciples had forsaken him and fled, well, Judas did a little bit more, but could he also be redeemed? So Judas remains a quite enigmatic figure in the Gospel of Mark. And I give him a lot of attention because he's usually just cast as the bad guy, rather than trying to figure out, well, what was his problem? Is he trying to motivate Jesus to act? Is he trying to get Jesus to take his place as the King of the Jews? Is he looking for a big miracle here in Jerusalem? So we don't know. But he's very helpful for helping us as readers try to figure out what do we want from Jesus, and why are we so happy to condemn Judas? Right? In terms of the naked young man in the garden, oh my goodness. Well, okay. So when Jesus gets arrested in the Gospel of Mark, there's a young man. It's the same term used, by the way, for the young man who happens to be sitting at the tomb when the angels get there. And Jesus gets arrested, and the disciples flee. And this fellow is about to flee as well. And the guards, or the people who arrest Jesus, grab hold of this fellow's garment, and he flees away naked. And that's it. Is this naked young man us? Fleeing naked, as if everything we knew has been stripped from us. And we're scared like the women at the tomb were scared, and we're scared like the disciples in Gethsemane were scared. And we're scared like Jesus is scared, because he's scared. Again, he's about to die. Are we this naked young man? Or is this naked young man actually the young man who's at the tomb, who kind of got his act together, put on a white robe, and showed up? Or is he an angel? And then we have the problem of something known as the secret Gospel of Mark. It is a real text. People who have seen it, people I know have seen it. And it suggests that this naked young man and Jesus were engaging in some sort of teaching and some sort of initiation, right? And it sounds not entirely kosher. Was it originally part of the Gospel of Mark? I don't think so. I think Mark ended at 16:8. And I don't think the whole story about this initiation with this naked young man was part of the original Gospel. But I do think it was probably an early addition to the Gospel, written by some monks who thought that additional material, perhaps dealing with what some monks were doing and what they were learning, was added on. And there are books written about this by very, very good scholars who disagree both on when it was written, by whom it was written, for what it was written, and they disagree on some of the earlier scholarship on the Gospel of Mark, including the person who first published the secret Gospel of Mark, Morton Smith, who's a story in himself. For more, you have to read my book.
What do you think the purpose, perhaps the literary purpose, even though we don't really know much about it, Mark's Gospel doesn't really say much about him, but what do you think the point of that naked guy even was in the Gospel?
I think he's titillating. Mark is a good author. Mark is also a Greek author, and for all that people will say that Mark's Greek is not all that great, compared to Luke, it's not all that great, or compared to the Epistle to the Hebrews, it's not all that great. But Greek literature and Hebrew literature will frequently throw in these enigmatic characters, and they show up and they do something really interesting, and then they disappear. And they titillate the reader. So if we pay attention to minor characters, like some of the people whom Jesus heals, who show up like guest stars on a TV show, like they're there and then they're gone, or somebody who has a cameo in a movie here and then gone. I think they spark our imagination. And I think Mark would be delighted to know that people 2,000 years later are going, yeah, who was that naked guy? And what is he supposed to do? And does he represent all disciples? Or is that, in fact, what happened? Or does he set us up for Jesus crucified naked on the cross where people are casting lots for his garments? And we start thinking about, well, where does clothing come in? And well, what about that odd John the Baptist who dresses in a weird way? Or kings who sit around wearing purple, or a fellow who's wearing a white robe. Like, let's pay attention to what we're wearing. Does it remind us of baptism, which was done naked? So when are you stripped bare? Do you do it for purposes of intimacy? Do you do it for purposes of baptism? Do you do it as symbolic of taking away everything that might identify us so we stand completely naked before God? Is it a sign of embarrassment or shame for fleeing from Jesus? And should anybody who might have been a follower and then said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore, should they feel that same sort of shame? All that stuff and more is suggested by this naked guy. So what's he doing? He's teasing our imagination.
Are there Aramaic idioms in the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, or at least they're Aramaic phrases, which Luke doesn't like, so Luke tends to drop them out. They show up frequently in healing narratives. So when Jesus heals the 12-year-old daughter of the synagogue ruler, Matthew, by the way, just calls him a ruler because Matthew's not happy about like good synagogues, so we're going to get rid of just synagogue ruler. He's kind of like the president of the congregation, probably the patron. He's got a 12-year-old daughter. She's sick. The synagogue ruler, whose name is Jairus, goes to Jesus and asks for healing. Jesus gets interrupted by a bleeding lady, so he cures her. So by the time Jesus gets to Jairus' home, the girl is dead. And he throws everybody out except for a couple of disciples, the child's parents and the child's parents. And he takes the little girl by the hand and he says, Talit kumi, which means little girl, get up. Right. And she does. This is another one of those things like, and Jesus, who's so cool about this whole thing. She's walking around. Jesus says, make sure she has something to eat. I love that. He sounds like a Jewish mother. I'm stereotyping. When he heals a man who was deaf, he puts his hands on the man's ears and he says, Ephata, which is Aramaic for open. People who speak Hebrew may know the term poteach, which means to open. So Ephata is be open in Aramaic. And it sounds kind of like magical formulae. At least I think it does. So if I'm hearing a text read in Greek, as Mark has written, and suddenly Jesus is saying these strange words, which are unfamiliar to me, they may well have sounded like abracadabra or hocus pocus or whatever people say when they want to do a miracle trick or a magic trick. And I think it's a sense of verisimilitude, right? Little girl, get up or be open. They're not magical formulae, but they may have sounded like that to Greek speakers. And then we have Jesus from the cross who cries out in Aramaic. It was a kind of strange Aramaic, an Aramaic rendering of the first verse of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And it's different as we read it in both Matthew and Mark. Luke, of course, drops it out because Luke doesn't like Aramaic. And in John, Jesus is never going to say, why have you forsaken me? Because in John, Jesus and the Father are one. Like they're that tight. Did it sound like a magical call? Mark says that when he said that, some people thought he was calling the prophet Elijah. Well, that could be because Eli sounds like it's the beginning of Elijah's name, Eliyahu. So maybe he was. But it's that sense also of like, you're there. And this is what he really said. It's like watching a movie where everybody is actually really, French or really German or really Swahili. And suddenly, instead of English, you get that actual language being used. It's like, you are there. And now we're getting to the intimate part of Jesus. If Mark actually knew what he was saying and heard him saying these things and is giving us the original Aramaic. So looking at foreign words, looking at words in one language in a text that's written in another language, I think we pay attention there. What's going on? That's a marker saying something important is happening here. Pay attention.
And for my final question, when you look at the Gospel of Mark as a whole, and as you mentioned earlier, the text is it can be difficult to understand. Do you suspect that the author of Mark may have been intentionally difficult? And my second part to that question is, we may not have access currently, or we may never have access currently to sources that were written before Mark, uh, Markan sources. But do you think Mark, based on the fact that he can be difficult to understand, did leave some material out that we don't have access to?
Oh, all authors leave material out that we don't have, either that we don't have access to, or they're looking and say, yeah, I got this, I don't need that. So all writers have to choose. This is what I want to tell. They also have to choose, here is how I'm going to tell it, because you can have a datum, but then you have to figure out what words to use in order to figure out how I'm going to tell this particular story. So Mark knew that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Mark has to figure out, well, how am I going to tell this story? Through people who were telling these stories that eventually landed with Mark, they would have told them differently. Because it's not like they got tape recorders there or phones to say, can you say that again so I can get the direct quote? A number of early scholars have suggested that when Mark wrote at least the first 8 chapters, he was taking individual stories as if they were written on like individual note cards, or the metaphor that was used was pearls on a string. So I've got this story and this story and this story. He's going to put them arbitrarily wherever they land. I don't think that's the case. I think Mark is very carefully arranged. And Mark wants us to pay attention to what comes before and what comes after, because when you do that, you begin to see new things in the text. This is, by the way, part of the problem with lectionary readings is you only get like a little snippet and you don't know what comes before and you don't know what comes after. And from Mark originally, I think the entire text would have been heard at one sitting. It's not that long. So you can read it out loud in, say, an hour and a half. It's like going to a movie, and then people would think about the various juxtapositions or word repetitions or use of foreign languages and so on. I'm right now working on an Abingdon commentary on the book of Genesis. And I think the combined authors of Genesis put stuff in there to intrigue us. And clearly there's stuff that they knew that's left out, like who were the Nephilim and what exactly was going on with Noah and his sons and what happened to Isaac after Abraham almost sacrificed him because he's not there when Abraham returns. I mean, they know stuff, and I think they're putting in stuff designed to titillate the reader, designed to draw us in and make us a part of the interpretive process. Encouraging us to generate new stories on the basis of the stories that they gave, because that's how stories functioned back then. Designed to get us to raise questions so that when a storyteller comes up as somebody reading Genesis or parts of Genesis to a group of people, or somebody sitting in some house in Antioch or even in Northern Galilee reading the Gospel of Mark out loud, then people would turn to each other and say, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? So that the story becomes an occasion for people themselves to engage in conversation and then continue the story, either with the storyteller or with each other. And then at some point, somebody gets a written copy of the Gospel of Mark and they read it. And then people say, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And I think Mark has left these little teasers in there for us to say, pay attention here, gentle reader. What more are you going to do with this? Go back and look at the context of the Old Testament, and again, a Christian and anachronistic term, but go back and look at the context of these passages that I'm citing, what comes before and what comes after. Look at this word repetition, or look at each time I say and immediately, and then what happens when you do that. Look at what comes in parable, look at what comes in metaphor, and then look at what happens when Jesus says, I'm saying something plainly. Pay attention to dialogue. How is it said? Snarky, compassionate, didactic? How would you say it if you were reading this out loud, or you were doing a book on tape? What kind of tone would you use? So the naked young man in the garden, Mark saying, you guys figure it out. That's your job. These messianic secrets, you figure it out why it's there. Who do you think Jesus is? That's a question I'm posing to you. And you better get the right answer. And the right answer is he's the divine Son of God and he's coming back. But you have to get there on your own.
So again, I just want to remind everybody real quick, the link to purchase the Gospel of Mark, a beginner's guide to the good news, will be provided in the link in the description below and the pinned comment. That being said, Thank you very much for joining me today, AJ.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, and a pleasure to listen to what your readers have, what your viewers have to think, because that helps me when I go back and I say, Jacob's friends are interested in this and this. I should be interested in that too. So always a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.